Hello everybody, welcome back, Inspirational Landscapes. This is just a very brief session in which I want to carry on our theme of boundaries, but I want to talk specifically about Frederick Jackson Turner, American historian, and his frontier thesis about the development of the American West. And I want to say something about that partly because it fits into our theme of boundaries that we're talking about right now, but also in preparation for a case study that we're going to look at in more detail over the next few weeks towards the end of the module, the frontier of the American West. And we're going to look at Western movies as a quintessentially geographical film genre. And we've bumped into that case study already, the frontier of the American West, a couple of times, but we're going to look at it in more detail later on. And I want you to be aware of Turner's frontier thesis as kind of a background to some of the things that we're going to say about Westerns over the next few weeks. So Turner, 1861 to 1932, he was an American historian, and since his work is kind of about how things changed over time, I thought it would be appropriate to show two photographs of him, showing how he changed over time. So there's Turner at the earlier and in the later stages of his career. But his most famous paper is a paper called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, which he originally presented in 1893 and then appeared subsequently in a number of publications. And I've put a link there to the text that you can access, and I'll put that link on the KLE, so if you want to, you can read what Turner had to say about the significance of the frontier in American history. Now, Turner's basic point is that everything to do with the development of America, the history of the American people, it's all to do with the fact that it's been a frontier country. The map in the bottom there just shows stages of the westward movement of population, settlement on the east coast, and then gradual movement westward of the pioneers, the farmers, the railroads, the cattlemen, the settlers, and gradually filling in the country from east to west in wave after wave of lines of frontier. And that's the argument behind the frontier thesis, that this has been fundamental in the economic development of the country, but also the intellectual development of the country. And I've just put a line there that straight away gives you a flavour of Turner's thesis, and also straight away flags up one of its most fundamental problems. Turner says, the existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. Well, you have your initial problem right there, the racist colonial underpinnings of this whole idea, the idea that there is free land. Turner's supposition, Turner's recasting of history, is that when settlers arrived in America, there was nobody there, so the land was free for the taking. Clearly not correct, clearly ignoring Native Americans, but selling a particular version of American history that justifies American history. Here's a few more quotations from Turner's thesis. Talking about the advance of settlement westward, he says, in this advance, the frontier is the outer edge of the waves of settlement moving westwards. The meeting point, and this is a really famous and offensive statement, the meeting point between savagery and civilization. The most significant thing about the frontier is that it lies at the hither edge of free land. Again, that idea that there was no one there, they weren't actually moving into occupied territory, talking as if they're moving into unoccupied territory. And he says, to the frontier, the American intellect owes its striking characteristics, that coarseness and strength combined with acuteness and inquisitiveness, that dominant individualism. But never again will such gifts of free land offer themselves. So you're getting a feeling here for what Turner's frontier thesis is saying, and he's relating that background point to every aspect of American development. There are some serious problems there from our point of view, and these are problems that we're going to pick up when we look at Westerns later on, because Westerns also, many of them, are reiterating and supporting and justifying this view of history, this manifest destiny of the Americans to overtake that continent. So there's a problem of the notion of free land and the implications of that for the population that were already there. And it's a self-justifying, inherently racist version of the conqueror's history. That's how history works. Whoever wins the battle, whoever conquers a territory, the histories that then survive into history, those tend to be the conqueror's version, the victor's version of history. For our module, there are some really interesting points to pull out and relate to other things that we've talked about. For example, the idea that we can look at this moving transition of a frontier across a continent and use what's sometimes called the ergodic approach. You might have come across this when people have talked about W.M. Davis's geographical cycle, the idea if things are changing over time as a boundary moves through space, then instead of studying change over time over a long period, we can instead go to different locations and see examples of these different time stages. So at any point in time in the transition of a frontier, we can go ahead of the frontier and see the unsettled, uncivilized, savage bit, if you like, using Turner's terminology, or at the same time we can head back behind the frontier and go back, in this case, go back to the east coast of America and see essentially a later stage in that process of development. So in much the same way as thinking about Davis's geographical cycle, instead of sitting in one location for tens of thousands or millions of years to watch the landscape change, we can go to different locations to see these different stages of landscape development. So there's an equivalence there in some sense between other ideas that we've seen in geography and this idea of the moving frontier across the United States. So I just wanted to mention this. I wanted you to be aware of this idea, Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, because I'm going to refer back to it. I'm going to mention it a few times, no doubt, when we're talking about westerns later on. Now, I've put some additional links to short videos on the KLE, and it's going to be useful background, as I say, to our case study on westerns. But if you're not totally enamoured with the idea of talking about westerns later on, well, it isn't only westerns for which this is a relevant idea that you need to know about. We've said already something about the idea that national art can be inspired by national landscapes. We talked about the Canadian Group of Seven and that postage stamp. Well, this is another example of that, and J.W. McCoubrey in 1963 in a book called The American Tradition in Painting, he said, "Our art is possessed by the spaciousness and emptiness of the land itself. No American painter can ignore it." Well, what he's saying there about painting, I'm going to expand that for you and think back to what we were just talking about in a previous video about indigenous filmmakers in Canada being influenced by the landscape around them and putting an indigenous interpretation on the landscape to counteract the interpretations of landscape made by other filmmakers before them. Well, in cinema, in painting, in poetry, in literature, the characteristics of the national landscape underpin characteristics that go into the literature, the music of people who are living in, who are based in, who are grounded, literally grounded in those landscapes. So being aware of Turner's transition thesis, the way that people are thinking about landscape, is going to be a really important background to you. Even if you're not interested in the westerns, it'll be an interesting background to you if you're interested in art, music, literature, or other aspects of ways in which people have been influenced by landscape. And we're going to come on and talk about that in future weeks.